The appraisal came back on a Thursday morning in May of 1986, and Roy Tatum set it on the desk without much ceremony. He turned to page 3 before Wade Harlan had even gotten his coat off the back of the chair. Roy ran a red pen under one line. North 80, brush and waste ground, no certified water, no contributory value beyond rough acreage. Wade looked at the sentence longer than he needed to. So what does that do to the loan? He asked. Roy capped the pen. Takes about $12,000 out of your borrowing base, he said. 80 acres is 80 acres on paper, but the bank can't lend against brush. Wade folded the appraisal once and put it inside his coat. He did not argue. There was not much in the report to argue with. The brush was real. The fence was down in 3 places. Nobody had drilled a well on the North 80 in living memory. The little pond at the southeast corner held water maybe 4 months out of 12. But Roy Tatum's appraiser had walked that ground in May. Wade's father had always said July was when the North 80 told the truth. Curtis Mabin had spent 9 minutes on the North 80 back in May. Wade knew because he'd watched him do it. Curtis had parked his truck on the county road, walked as far as the fence line, looked at the broom sedge and the shrinking pond through a pair of sunglasses, made 2 notes on a clipboard, and driven off toward the next parcel on his list. He had not walked the ditch. He had not walked the ridge. He had looked at 80 acres the way a man looks at a used car he has already decided not to buy, which was to say, from a distance, and only long enough to confirm what he expected to find. Wade did not blame him outright. An appraiser with 40 properties on a spring schedule did not have time to walk every fence line on every waste parcel in the county, and the North 80 had a reputation that went back further than Curtis Mabin's job did. But a man could be doing his job correctly and still be wrong about the ground. By that afternoon, half the feed store in Milan had heard about the appraisal. Dean Cobble was leaning against the counter when Wade came in for mineral tubs. Bank finally wrote down what everybody already knew, Dean said. Another man near the fertilizer bags didn't even turn around. Broom's Edge doesn't pay notes. Somebody else, further back, said what people had been saying about the North 80 since before Wade was born. If that 80 was worth clearing, your daddy would have cleared it 30 years ago. Wade did not answer any of it. Near the door, a man he didn't know well added one more line as Wade carried the tubs out. Otis tried running a few head up there back when I was a boy. Didn't last a season. Wade hadn't heard that one before. He didn't ask about it in the store. He loaded the tubs into the truck bed and drove the 11 miles home with the radio off, filing the sentence away next to the rest. What bothered him was not that the bank had lied. It was that the bank had looked in May. That evening Lila had the ledger open on the kitchen table when Wade came in, the same page she'd had open for 3 days running. She did not look up right away. "I moved the hay line down and the vet line down," she said. "If we don't find 12,000 somewhere, we're not just skipping fence repair. We're selling into a summer market, and summer market is a bad market. How many head? 15, if we want to keep the operating loan clean through winter." She closed the ledger. "I don't need it to be pretty. I need it to water cows." That was the whole conversation. Wade went back out to check fence before dark, the appraisal still folded inside his coat where he'd put it that morning. Wade Harlan was 39 years old that summer. He ran 42 cow-calf pairs on 160 acres his father, Otis, had held onto through droughts, through the 70s land boom, and through the first hard years of the 80s before dying in 1981 with the mortgage paid and not much else. Wade had kept the herd steady since then, the kind of steady that didn't make news but didn't lose ground either. Sullivan County that year was full of operations that had stopped being steady. Farm credit was tightening. Small banks were watching every collateral line like it might move on its own. A man who lost $12,000 off his borrowing base in the spring did not have a lot of room to argue about brush. $12,000, in Wade's arithmetic, was hay he wouldn't be able to buy in August, mineral he'd have to cut back on, a fence job that would wait another year, and 15 cows he'd probably have to sell at a summer price nobody wanted to sell at. Lila kept the books, and she did not cry over the number, and she did not pretend it wasn't bad. She simply moved lines around on a page until the page told her what it was going to tell her regardless. Wade thought, more than once that spring, about something his father used to say about the North 80. Otis had never explained it fully, and Wade had never asked him to. That ground sweats in August, if you know where to look. Wade had heard it as a boy and filed it away the way boys file away things their fathers say without paying attention to. He hadn't thought about it seriously since Otis died. But an appraisal with his family's name on it, cutting his herd down to size over 80 acres of broomsedge, had a way of making old sentences come back. The North 80 did not look like a secret in May. It looked like exactly what the appraiser had written. Broomsedge the color of an old penny once it dried out, brush thick in the fence corners. Blackberry choking the ditch bank on the east side. The pond in the southeast corner already shrinking. No certified well, no tank, no obvious reason anyone would run cattle on it if they had somewhere better to put them. Wade did not walk it looking for anything in May. He walked it in July because July was dry, and dry was when his father's sentence would either mean something or it wouldn't. On the 19th of July, 1986, Wade was patching fence on the North 80 with a roll of wire over his shoulder. The county had gone 3 weeks without real rain. Pastures on both sides of the road had turned the color of dust. The broomsedge on the ridges was as brown as it ever got. That was when he saw it, a line of green running on a diagonal across the pasture. Not bright, not the kind of green that jumped out at a man driving past on the county road. Just green in a way that nothing around it was green. It started narrow near the upper fence, maybe 12 feet across, and widened as it ran downhill, until by the time it reached the lower end it was closer to 30 feet wide. It held that width for almost 300 yards before it disappeared into the blackberry along the ditch. Wade stood with the wire still on his shoulder and looked at it for a long moment. Then he took the notebook out of his shirt pocket, the same kind of notebook his father had always carried, and he wrote 3 lines. Green line, North 80, July 19, dry both sides. He came back the next morning with a 1/4-inch steel rod, the kind used for probing fence post holes. Outside the green line, the rod hit dry packed clay at about 20 inches. He moved to the center of the line and pushed again. At 18 inches, the rod slid into something cooler, tackier, damp in a way the ground around it was not. He tested every 20 feet along the line, walking it from the upper fence toward the ditch. The pattern held the whole way, dry outside, damp inside. It was not a random wet patch. A random wet patch didn't hold a straight line for 300 yards through a drought. Something under that ground was moving water, and it had been moving it long before anyone thought to look. The line ran out at the blackberry. Wade cut into the thicket with a machete his father had kept in the barn for exactly this kind of work. Thorns tearing at his sleeves, mosquitoes rising off the wet ground the deeper he went. Close to the ditch bank he found what the green line had been leading him to. A half-buried length of clay tile, the outlet crumbled and packed with silt and root mat. The kind of old drainage work a man might have put in decades before anybody living now had walked that ground. It did not gush. When Wade pulled the root mat loose with his hands, what came out was a trickle, no wider than a pencil, running slow and cold into the mud. It was not enough water to save a farm, but it was enough to prove the bank had missed the North 80's only honest sentence. That night, Wade went into the back room and pulled down a cardboard box he hadn't opened since the year his father died. Inside were seed tags, old vet receipts, a few field notebooks gone soft at the corners, and a hand-drawn map of the farm that Otis had made sometime in the 50s. Wade spread it flat on the kitchen table. In the corner marked North 80, in his father's small handwriting, was a single word, seep. Beside it, in the same hand, runs after dry spell if ditch kept open. Wade sat with that for longer than he meant to. For 5 years he had believed the North 80 was something his father never got around to fixing. That night he understood it was something his father had been waiting for him to notice. He thought back to the man at the feed store, the one who'd said, Otis tried running a few head up there and it didn't last a season. Wade did the arithmetic in his head. If his father had tried it in the years right after the tile would have started failing, before the roots and silt had finished the job, that would explain a partial flow that gave out just when a man needed to count on it. Otis hadn't been wrong about the North 80. He had been early and unlucky, and then too busy keeping the rest of the farm together to come back and finish what the ground had started showing him. Wade folded the map along its old creases and put it back in the box, but he kept the notebook page out, on the table, where he could see it in the morning. A drilled well was the obvious next step, so Wade got a quote, $8,600 to $10,400, with no guarantee of flow on ground with a clay pan that deep. Roy Tatum wasn't going to lend against a speculative hole in the ground, and Wade wasn't going to ask him to. Lila looked at the quote and set it down. "What can you do with what's already there?" she asked. Everybody had told Wade to find water by going deeper. He decided to go sideways instead. The work was not clean and it was not fast. Wade cleared 36 feet of the old clay tile along the ditch bank, working in July heat with a shovel whose handle cracked halfway through the second day. He finished the afternoon with a spare handle from the barn and a rag wrapped around his palm where a blister had opened. Mosquitoes rose out of the wet ground every time he disturbed it, and by evening his forearms were scratched from wrist to elbow from the blackberry he'd had to keep clearing back just to get a wheelbarrow through. He dug a shallow collection trench where the moisture line began, lined it with gravel he hauled in 5-gallon buckets because the ground was too soft for the truck, patched the worst sections of tile with short lengths of perforated pipe, and wrapped the joints in burlap sacking to keep the silt out. From the outlet he ran 3/4-inch black polyline downhill to a 300-gallon galvanized stock tank he'd bought used and patched himself with a scrap of sheet metal and roofing cement. No pump, no electricity. Gravity did the work, the same way it had been trying to do the work since long before Wade was born. Lila brought water and sandwiches down to the ditch twice that week and stood looking at the mud and the root mat and the sacking for a while before she said anything. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "It's not supposed to look like much," Wade said. "It's supposed to run." Pipe and fittings ran him $420. Gravel was $180. The used tank and its repair came to $95. A neighbor ran a backhoe over for an afternoon for $260 in cash and a favor owed. Fence and posts to keep cattle off the wet trench cost another $130. All told, Wade was into the repair for a little over $1,300. The first night, the tank held 47 gallons. After he cleared more root mat from the outlet the following week, it held 112. By the time the trench and line were finished at the end of the month, the tank was filling at roughly 310 gallons a day in the driest stretch of a dry summer, with no well, no power line, and no miracle. Just an old tile line that had been there the whole time, waiting on somebody to clear it out. Wade did not turn 42 pairs loose on the North 80 all at once. He tested 12 dry cows first, watching how they used the ground and the tank, then 18 pairs. By the end of August, with a rotation and a strand of temporary fence, 27 pairs were grazing the North 80 on water that had not existed, as far as the bank was concerned, 3 months earlier. The seep did not make the North 80 good land. The broom sedge on the ridges was still broom sedge. But it made the ground usable, and in the summer of 1986, usable was enough. Lila crossed 15 cows off the list of animals they'd been planning to sell. In September, Wade drove back into Milan and set a folder on Roy Tatum's desk. There was no speech in it, just flow records kept morning and evening since the day the tile started running, repair receipts, photographs of the cleared outlet and the tank filling, his father's hand-drawn map with the word seep circled, a grazing log showing 27 pairs on ground the bank had written off as brush. Roy looked through it without saying much, then picked up the phone and sent the appraiser back out. Curtis Mabin had written the original line from the cab of his truck in May, looking at broom sedge and a shrinking pond through the windshield. In September, Wade walked him the length of the green line on foot, had him probe the ground on both sides of it the way Wade had done in July, and stood with him at the tank while it filled, slow and steady, in front of both of them. The new appraisal did not call the North 80 good pasture. It called it a partial pasture with a documented seasonal to perennial livestock water source and measurable improvement. The bank restored most of the $12,000. The bank did not apologize. Banks rarely do. It changed the number. In that season, that was apology enough. At the feed store, Dean Cobble never said he'd been wrong. He just stopped bringing it up. Wade noticed, without saying anything about it either, that Dean's hay order that fall was smaller than usual, and that Dean didn't ask why Wade's was too. One Saturday, Frank Bell caught Wade at the gate and asked to borrow the probe rod. Frank had a low spot on the west end of his own place, soft ground he'd driven around with the tractor for going on 10 years without ever once putting a shovel to it. Walk it in July, Wade told him, not May. Frank probed it the second week of September, later than Wade would have picked, but he found damp soil at 19 inches anyway, and he called a contractor about tile before the month was out. He never did thank Wade outright. He brought the probe rod back clean and left it hanging on the gatepost, which in that part of the county meant about the same thing. By October, the North 80 still did not look like good land to anyone passing on the county road. There was still broom sedge on the ridges. There was still blackberry along the ditch. But there was a tank at the lower fence line, with water sliding into it all day. Slow and plain and steady, there was a notebook full of numbers. There were 27 pairs still on the farm that had almost been sold in August. And there was a bank file in Milan with one sentence crossed out and another written in its place. The bank had seen brush. The appraiser had seen broom sedge. The feed store had seen a man trying to borrow against waste, but Wade had waited for July, when bad ground tells the truth. The North 80 had not been worthless. It had only been misread. If stories about forgotten farms, old wells, hidden water, and the quiet wisdom of rural land mean something to you, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from.